Okay, yesterday we were talking about the halacha in the Mishnah, which states that in a situation where Ruvain buys the Brooklyn Bridge from, let's say, we'll call him Shyster Seller. Okay, Shyster Seller sells Ruvain the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's a bad sale. So Ruvain has a right to collect back whatever he paid for the purchase price. Plus, he has a right to collect whatever investment he made to improve the property, and the value, the appreciation of the property. However, the Mishnah had said that he's only entitled to collect from, he can collect even from encumbered property, which means that if the Shyster, after he had sold to Ruvain the Brooklyn Bridge, he sold another property to Shimon, Ruvain has a right to go even after Shimon in the event that the seller no longer has any free property. He can go after Shimon's purchase, because it came after Ruvain. However, that's only for the principal purchase price. But when it comes to stuff that improved in value, then Ruvain cannot go after Shimon for that. Now the question was, why not? He can only go after Shyster seller's free and unencumbered property. He cannot go after property that has already been encumbered and sold to Shimon. The question was, why not? Ula gave one answer and Hananya gave the other answer. Ula's answer is because it was never recorded in a shtar. Because it was never recorded in a shtar, there's no way for that future seller Shimon to protect himself, to know that he might be on the hook for that additional amount. But now Hananya gives a different answer. Hananya's answer is because it's a non-finite amount. There's no way to know how much potentially that appreciation value is going to be, and therefore there's no way for any future buyer of the Shyster to protect himself from being on the hook for a non-finite amount. The Gemara then had asked the question, and this brings us to the top of Nun Aleph and Mad Aleph and Gittin. The question is, according to Hananya, does he agree to Ula that it's also a problem of it not being recorded in the shtar? In other words, for Hananya, in order to collect encumbered property that's already been sold to Shimon by the Shyster, does he require that it be a value that is recorded in a shtar plus a finite value? Or would he argue that as long as it's a finite value, even if it's not recorded in a shtar, the Ruvain has a right to go after encumbered property? So the Gemara says, Tashma, let's come and listen. The Itmar, the following psak was given in Ksuvis, Misha Meis v'hiniach shtei banos uben. A man dies and he leaves over 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Now, who is the heir in that situation? The son. The daughters are not heirs. The daughters are entitled to the following. They are entitled to something called mizonos, which means that until they get married, they can be sustained by the estate for their daily living expenses. Plus, they're entitled to something else called parnasa, which means that when they get married, they can take 10%. The Chachamim said they get 10% of the estate. 10% of the estate. Each one gets 10% of the estate. So now, the kadma harishana v'nat la'isr nechasim v'lo hispika shniya legabos at shemei saben. So here's what happened. Daughter number 1 gets married, takes her 10% out of the estate. Before daughter number 2 has a chance to get married, the son dies. Now, automatically, who does the estate belong to now?
His children.
Well, let's say the brother has no children. Okay, he's got no heirs. So it now goes to the sisters. The sisters now become the owners of the estate. So the psak is, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Shniya Vitra. Rabbi Yochanan says that the second daughter doesn't get the extra 10%. They divide whatever's left in the estate, and the first daughter ended up with a little bit more because she got her 10%. And the reason is, according to Rabbi Yochanan, because the whole provision of 10% is so that you don't want a girl to get married without any dowry. But now she has an entire half of an estate, so there's no reason to give her the 10%. And on that, Amarle Rabbi Chanina, and this is where Rabbi Chanina disagrees, and he says, Gedola mizu amru, motziin leparnasa ve'ein motziin lemizonos, ve'at amart shniya vitra. So he says, his argument is like this. He says, the rabbis went so far as to say that even though a girl cannot sue the estate and confiscate encumbered property that's already been sold off by the estate, to get her daily living expenses, but she is allowed to go after the encumbered property of the estate for her parnasa, for this 10%. So Rabbi Chanina's point is, how can you tell me that daughter number 2 is not entitled to the 10% as well? That's his argument. The point, what we want to extract from here is parnasa. The Gemara says, "V'ha parnasa demekatz kaitza michtav lo ksiva v'kal motzia." What you see from this whole discussion is that parnasa is something that is a finite amount, so it certainly fits the criterion of Rabbi Chanina to say that you can collect from encumbered property. The only thing is that it's not recorded in a shtar. It's never recorded in a shtar that a daughter gets 10%. It's a takanas chachamim. So therefore, we want to prove from here that according to Rabbi Chanina, you don't require it to be in writing in order to be able to collect from encumbered property. All you need is that it's got to be a finite amount. So the Gemara says, "Shiny parnasa kevin deisle kala kaman dechsiva dami." The Gemara says that's not a raya. You know why? Because when a man dies, everyone knows that his daughters get 10%. It's tantamount to that being written. In other words, if anyone is going to purchase money from the decedent's estate, he's going to know automatically that he might be on the hook for that 10% parnasa in the event that there's no money, there are no assets that are unencumbered left in the estate. So therefore he'll know to protect himself. So it's no different from something being recorded in a shtar because it's public information. And therefore it's no raya. But in our case, where a guy, Reuven bought the Brooklyn Bridge and then invested in it, and there's a fixed amount, let's say there is a fixed amount that he put into it, so then maybe you could argue that it would have to be written in order for him to be able to go after encumbered property in addition to the idea that it has to be a fixed amount.
Do you think for Tikkun Olam they wouldn't allow this for a girl to get 10% for parnasa if it's sold, according to Chanina? Who's going to lend money?
Well,
unmarried daughters.
So you have to remember that the whole idea of Tikkun Olam is very delicate. There are times when the rabbis use their jurisprudence to invoke Tikkun Olam, and sometimes they don't. It all depends on the time and the place and the remedy. There's more Tikkun Olam to make sure that a girl gets 10% so that she can get married. That's also Tikkun Olam.
Nobody would lend, right?
Right. But no one's going to want to marry her if we don't give her 10%. So there are two opposing Tikkun Olam concerns. Now, Masav Rav Huna bar Manoach. So now Rav Huna bar Manoach brings a challenge. It says, "Mesu benoseya nizonos minachasim b'nei chorin, v'hi nizonos minachasim mishubadim impnei shehi kabbalas chav." Now we're parachuting in the middle of a discussion. Again from Ksubis, but I'm going to simplify the case. A woman is divorced or widowed, and she marries a new husband. The new husband gives her a guarantee as follows. Now he gives her a guarantee that I hereby promise that I will sustain your daughters, my stepdaughters, for 5 years. Okay, then, in addition to that, he and his new wife, in addition to stepdaughters, he has another daughter with his new wife. So he's got his own daughter, let's say he's got one stepdaughter and one daughter. And then both the father and the mother pass away. So the halacha is that since the stepdaughter really had a legal commitment of being sustained for 5 years, she actually has a stronger creditor stance than the daughter does, than his natural daughter. And therefore, his stepdaughter can collect from even encumbered property of the estate, whereas his natural daughter can only collect from unencumbered property in the estate. And the reason why his stepdaughter has a stronger claim is because there was a debt that was created to the stepdaughter at the time of marriage. So the Gemara's question is, how can, here too, there was no shtar written, it was all a verbal contract that was made. And as long as it's a finite amount of a 5-year sustenance of mazonos, you see that's all that's required. So therefore we want to argue that this would go according to Rabbi Chanina, and like Rabbi Chanina says, as long as it's finite, even if it's not recorded in a shtar, you can collect from encumbered property. The Gemara says that's also not a raya, because hacha b'mayaskinon b'shekanu miyada. No, it could be that there was a kinyan made with his wife to provide for the stepdaughter for 5 years. And anytime there's a kinyan made, like Rashi says, a kinyan is meant to be recorded in a shtar. Whether or not it was recorded in the shtar apparently may not make a difference, but the very fact that it was a kinyan done in front of two Eidim makes it tantamount to being recorded in a shtar. But the Gemara says, Ihachi, banos nami. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then when a man, maybe you could make the same argument that a man committed to his own natural daughter, that he's going to sustain them, both in his lifetime and after his death. Why don't you say he made a kinyan with his daughters too? So it's like where do you arbitrarily get to say that he only made a kinyan with one and not the other? So the Gemara says, no, b'shekanu lezu v'lo kanu lezu. That he only made a kinyan with for his stepdaughter, he didn't make a kinyan for his own daughter. So the Gemara asks, my piska. Well, that's so arbitrary. Why would you say he only made a kinyan for his stepdaughter and not for his daughter? So the Gemara says, no, it does make sense. Bas ishto da havai b'shas kinyan mahani lo kinyan, bito de lo havai b'shas kinyan lo mahani lo kinyan. Well, logically, when does a man make a kinyan to commit himself to provide for his stepdaughter? At the time when he marries his new wife and she brings her daughter into the marriage. His own daughter hasn't been born yet. So therefore, it makes sense to say that he made a kinyan with his wife at the time of the marriage. There was no kinyan made for his own daughter because there was no basis for making that kinyan, and that's why it makes sense to say that his stepdaughter is the stronger creditor than his daughter, because there was a kinyan made that is tantamount to writing a shtar. But the Gemara says, Milo askinan da'ahuturavayu bishas kinyan vehechidami degirsha va'ahadra. But the Gemara says, but you can't say across the board that's going to be that way, because I could come up with a very simple case where both the daughter and the stepdaughter are alive at the time of the kinyan. Here's the case. Man marries a woman together and brings the stepdaughter into the marriage, and then he has a daughter with her, and then he divorces her and decides to remarry her. And it's at that point that he makes a kinyan to sustain his stepdaughter for 5 years, and he also makes a kinyan to sustain his daughter for the same amount of time. So why are you telling me that he's only making a kinyan for the stepdaughter, not the daughter? You can't just tell me across the board that works that way. You'd have to qualify it and say that it all depends with whom he made the kinyan. So the Gemara says, you're right. Elabito de b'tanai beistin ka'achla lo mahani la kinyan, bas ishto de lav b'tanai beistin ka'achla mahani la kinyan. The Gemara says, I'll tell you, the real issue is that since there's already a provision for his daughter, that he has to provide her with mizonos from his estate, both when he's alive and after he dies, if he were to make a kinyan, that would not be effective at all. It's only with his stepdaughter that there is no rabbinic provision that he's obligated to provide for her. That's why the kinyan helps and makes her an even stronger creditor. But the Gemara says, V'chi migra gara? That doesn't make any sense. What you're going to tell me, because the rabbis make a special accommodation for a man's own natural daughter, he can't strengthen her power of collection by making a kinyan with her to fortify that? That doesn't make any sense. Elabito keben dibitenai based in ka'achla emar tzvari atfisa. The Gemara says, here's the real answer. When a man has his own natural daughter, and he knows that she's going to be living off his estate by law, by the requirements of the Bayston, so you could argue that perhaps the father already started shtupping her with money. Maybe he started giving her what my wife affectionately calls a kneppel, right? You know what a kneppel is? Rabbi Rosenberg knows what a kneppel is, right? It's like a stash. He started.
Kneppel money you hide in your purse.
Yeah, right. It's a little stash, right? That he said. So he said, it's like Jewish parents always say, "Shh, don't tell anyone. Take some money." Right? Right. That's the way. I don't know why it's got to be hate, but they say, "Here, take the money." Right. So he put away some money already, gave it to his daughter. No one knows about it, and that's why we say that we don't give her this. We will not allow him to upgrade the collection power of his daughter, because we suspect that she has already collected money. So therefore, we don't want to fortify her strength to enable her to collect from encumbered property, because then she may be collecting more than she's rightfully entitled to. With a stepdaughter, that we don't have those same concerns. If he makes a kinyan with the mother or the stepdaughter to obligate himself to the stepdaughter, so then we will fortify her strength and make her a creditor as if she has a shtar, and therefore she can collect even from encumbered property. But the bottom line is that we haven't brought a raya as to whether Chananya requires as to whether Chananya requires both a shtar and a davar and ketziva and a fixed amount, or whether any time that a debt is a rights of collection is a fixed amount, you can collect it from encumbered property. Tashma, let's listen to the next thing. Amar Rav Nasan Emasai Bizman Shekara Mekcho Shel Sheni Lishvacho Shel Rishon. Aval Kadam Shvacho Shel Rishon Lemekcho Shel Sheni Gova Minachasim Mishubadim Alma Mishum Delo Kadimhu. Now, I'm going to explain to this sugya to you the way Tosfos learns it, which is as follows. We're no longer questioning whether Chananya requires either just a fixed amount or whether it requires both a fixed amount and a shtar like Ula does. Here, the purpose of bringing this tashma in the name of Rabbi Nasan is to demonstrate a kasha on Ula, because this brisa seems to indicate that according to Atana, the law is like Rabbi Chanina, that as long as it's a fixed amount that is owed to this guy who got cheated out of the Brooklyn Bridge, and he made building improvements, he has a right to collect even from encumbered property, even when there's no shtar that's written. So it's a kasha on Ula. Now, where do we see this? We see this from this qualification of Rabbi Nasan. He says that the only time that Ruvain, who's the buyer of the Brooklyn Bridge, does not have a right to go after Shimon for his appreciation of the Brooklyn Bridge is only when Shimon bought his property before Ruvain did all of the appreciation work. But if Ruvain appreciated the property and invested, let's say, $100,000 into the bridge, and then Shimon bought his property from the same shyster seller, so since Shimon was aware that he might be on the hook for that additional, not only for the purchase price of the Brooklyn Bridge, but also for the appreciation, investment, and all the other things, Reuven will have rights of collection from Shimon even though it's an encumbered property. What do you see from here? The Gemara says you see from here that even though there was no shtar, there was nothing in writing for the appreciation investment, nevertheless it was a davar katzutz, it was a fixed amount, and Reuven can go after Shimon. So you see that Ula, it's a kasha on Ula. We don't see anywhere that the criterion is that it has to be in writing. So the Gemara says, you're right, but that's a machlokas tanoi. It is a machlokas tanoi. The Tanya ein motzin lachilas peros l'shevach karkos l'mazon isha v'habanos menachasim mishubadim mipnei tikkun ha'olam lefisha in ksuvin. That according to this brisa, the Tanakama says that the reason why you can't take from encumbered property whenever you do land appreciation or to pay for your wife's mazonos is because it's not recorded in a shtar, and therefore there's no way for a future buyer to protect himself. And on that, Amar Rabbi Yossi v'chimati kan olam yesh bezu v'halo ein ketzuvim. And on that, Rabbi Yossi argues and he says that's not the Tikkun Olam provision. The Tikkun Olam provision is not because it's not written in a shtar, but rather because it's not a fixed amount. So you see that this is the machlokus exactly between Ula and Rabbi Chanina. According to Ula, the criterion is that it has to be recorded in a shtar, and according to Rabbi Chanina, the issue is that it has to be a fixed amount. And therefore, that's the same machlokus that we've seen up until now, and that's the maskana of the Gemara. It's a machlokus. Next, let's go to the last part of the Mishnah. V'hamotze mitzia lo yishba. The rabbis made another Tikkun Olam provision, which is that if a person finds a lost object, he never has to swear, even if there's suspicion against him that he's only returning a portion of it and he's not returning the whole thing. The rabbi said if we're going to make a guy have to swear because the owner accuses him of not returning the whole amount, no one's going to want to return items. So therefore we never make a person swear. So let's look at a halacha that's said by Rabbi Yitzchak. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Shnei kisin kshurin matzasali, v'halo omer lo matzasi ela echad nishba. That if a guy returns a bag of money, and the owner says, hey, wait a minute, this bag of money was tied to another bag of money. And the guy says, I don't know what you're talking about. This is the only bag of money that I found. So the halacha is he has to swear. Not like our Mishnah said. Shnei shvorim kishurim matzasali, v'halo omer lo haya ela echad eino nishba. But if a guy returns an ox and the owner says, hey, there were two oxen that were tied together, then he doesn't have to swear. Why? My time of shvorin minaschi mehadadi, kisin lo minaschi mehadadi. The reason is because there's more suspicion by the money bags than there is by the oxen. Oxen, even if you tie them up because of the fact that they're living creatures and they move around all the time, there's a far greater likelihood that they're going to break apart from each other on their own. So it's very plausible that this guy actually only found one ox. But money bags don't move against each other and they don't move of their own power. And therefore, if it's true that these money bags were tied together, then it's very suspicious why you only are returning one bag, and that's why you have to swear. The third case is Shnei Shvarim Kishurin Matzasa V'Halo Omer Matzasi V'Echzarti L'Cha Echad Mehen Raizel Nishba. The one case where you will have to swear even by oxen is if the owner says, hey, there were two oxen tied together, and the finder says, you're right, there were two oxen tied together, but I returned the first one yesterday, and now I'm returning the second one today. And the guy says, I don't know what you're talking about. It's the first time I'm seeing you. So in that case, again, there's suspicion here, and therefore the guy has to take a shvuah. The finder has to take a shvuah. So the Gemara now says, "For Rabbi Yitzchak Leslei Hamotzim Mitzia Lo Yishba Mimeitikon Ha'olam." So doesn't Rabbi Yitzchak agree with our Mishnah? How can he argue with our Mishnah? So the Gemara answers, "Hu da'amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov." He holds like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov that there are times when even though you feel like you're being a good Samaritan, a nice guy, if you arouse suspicion about yourself, you still are going to have to take a shvuah. So it's a machlokas. It seems like it's a machlokas tanoim between our Mishnah and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, pe'amim she'adam nishba al tainas asmo. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says in the Brisa that there are times when a person has to take a vow, has to take an oath, even though he's volunteering a claim. No one's claiming against him, he's volunteering the claim. Keitzad, what's the case? Mana le'avicha biyadi vehechaltiv pras hareza nishba. V'zehu shenishba al tainas atzma. He says the case is like this. Let's say a guy goes over to a yasam, he goes over to an orphan, and he says, when your father was alive, he had lent me money. He lent me $100, but I paid him back already 50. So I want to pay you back the other 50. So this is a situation where, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he's a moda b'miktzas ataina. He's only admitting to a partial claim, even though the claim was made by himself, right? But he still has to take a shvuah, so that's called. So the Gemara says, "V'chachamim omrim eino ela k'meishav avedo pater." The Chacham say no. It's like returning lost objects. You're volunteering. You're being a good Samaritan by telling the kid something that he didn't know, and therefore you don't have to take a shvuah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov lesle meishav aveda pater. So doesn't Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov hold that because you're being a good guy you shouldn't have to take a shvuah? Amar Rav b'to'an okatan. So Rav says, well, in reality, it's not the same thing, because here a child is making a claim. It's not that he completely volunteers and the kid doesn't know what he's talking about. Here you have a kid who comes along and says, hey, Mr. Jones or Mr. Schwartz, my father said that you owe him $100. And the guy says to the little kid, he says, it's true, Yingale, I borrowed $100 from your father, but I paid him back 50, and therefore I only owe him 50. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Katan midi mishasha yisbei? Since when does a Katan's claim have any bearing in halacha? There's a Mishnah that says that a claim made by a Katan is completely meaningless. You don't even have to respond to it at all. The Gemara says, my Katan gadol, my korele Katan delagavi mili da'aviv Katanu. The Gemara says, no, you're right. We're not talking about where the orphan is under bar mitzvah. The orphan is a 50-year-old guy. And he says, my father told me before he died that he lent you $100. I want the money back. So that's where we say that he has to take a shavua. But the Gemara says, so then why do you call him a katan? Because he's a katan as far as being ignorant of his father's affairs. No son can say with absolute certainty that my father, I know for a fact that you never paid this debt back to my father. How are you supposed to know? And therefore, the guy will, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, it's a claim, but it's not exactly like when you completely volunteer the information, like a being Meishav Aveda, because the guy's making a claim against you. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Ihachi tainas atzmo, tainas acherimu. So the Gemara says, but why do you call that Tainas Atzma? How can you say that's what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov means, where the orphan is making a claim? That's not called him volunteering the information. It's clear that someone else is making a claim against him. So the Gemara says, no, it's Tainas Achim v'hodoas Atzma. You're right. What he means to say is that someone else is making a claim against him and he's admitting to a portion of it. But wait a minute. Kulu ta'anasa nami tainas acher v'hodoas atzmaninu. All cases of moida b'mixas ataina. Even the Chachamim agree that you have to take a shvu. In that case, when someone makes a claim against you and you partially make an admission, the Chachamim agreed that in that case you'd have to take a shvua. So how can you? That's indefensible. What you're saying that here Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that's called tainas atzma. So Ella b'derabba kamiflagi. Now Rashi says that what you have to insert here is the Gemara saying you're right. We're talking about a kid now. We're going back to the case of it's a 10-year-old kid says, my father says you owe him $100, right? So that's the case that we're talking about. It's not really a valid claim. However, it generates a certain kind of guilt on behalf of the person who's returning, who's responding to the claim. And the machlokus is that in that situation, do we say that the guy's feeling, the guy's conscience may be gnawing at him, just like in any case where a creditor comes to him and asks him for the money? And this is the machlokus about Rabbi. The Omar Rabbi mipnei ma Omar Torah moda mixas atayna yishba. Why did the rabbi say in the first place that there is such a din? I believe this is a halacha l'Moshe Misina, that whenever a person admits partially to a claim, he has to take a shvua. The reason is because we're suspicious. Chazaka in adamei panav bifnei balchovo, v'hai bekule boy lemichberele, v'hai delo kafre mishum dein adamei panav bifnei balchovo. Because really, we have an assumption that every person has a conscience, and no one is going to say a bald-faced lie to someone who lent him money and knows that he owes him money. So when a guy says, you owe me $100, and the guy says 50, really, he doesn't want to lie. He rather would say, I owe you nothing, but he doesn't have the chutzpah to do that to someone who lent him the money. So therefore, he says, I owe you 50. So, and really, he would prefer to tell him, I owe you the full amount, and here's the full amount, but he doesn't have it. So really, he's trying to just squeak by until he's able to get the money together. So he says, listen, I'm not going to have the chutzpah to deny the whole claim, so I'll admit to a portion of the claim. I'll pay him what I have, and then later on, when I get the money, I'll give him the rest. But if I admit to it, he's going to come after me, and he's going to put my feet to the fire, and I don't want that.
If he says, I don't owe you anything, no shvua?
No shvua.
So he's better off lying.
Yeah, but no, that's the concern. He doesn't have chutzpah to lie. No.
Chutzpah to take a shvua?
He doesn't. No, the chazaka is that no one who owes money to someone is going to be able to have that level of gall to say to someone to his face, I owe you nothing. When the guy knows, he knows that I owe him the money. No one's going to have the gall to say, I owe you nothing. He'll change the amount. Okay, I owe you, but I only owe you 50. That's the chazaka. And that's why the rabbi said, we don't trust you. We don't trust you, and therefore take a shvua.
For the full amount?
No, take a shvua that you don't owe the other 50. You've admitted that you owe 50. Take a shvua that you don't owe the other 50. Okay? So that'll incentivize him to fess up, to confess, and that he owes the other 50. So this is the machlokas that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Sover Loshna Bo Loshma Bivno Eino Meyes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that a person is not going to have chutzpah either to the creditor himself or to the creditor's son. He still has that conscience, and therefore, even if the little kid muns him, he just can't bring himself to. He can't bring himself to, to say, I don't owe you anything. He's going to be guilt-ridden, and therefore he'll only acknowledge a portion of it, and that's why we make him take a shvua. And therefore he's not really considered to be fully returning an object. And the Rabbanan hold no, that if the son comes to me with a claim and he's not an adult, I don't feel any I don't feel any sense of conscience to the son. I only feel when the creditor himself is looking me in the face and he knows for sure that he lent me money, that's when I don't have the chutzpah to lie. But if the son doesn't know for sure if I'm lying or not, therefore a person will have chutzpah to lie, and therefore there's no suspicion if he's admitting to part of it. If he really was chutzpahdik, he would have denied all of it, right? And the fact, therefore, that he's admitting to part of it does not raise the suspicion, and therefore he doesn't have to take a shvuah because he's like a meshiv aveda. But in the final analysis in the Gemara, it seems that a person who is, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, the question still remains. If a person is truly a meshiv aveda by volunteering a lost object, then fine. You told me that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, in a situation where it's the kid's son, you have to take a shvuah because you're not like a meshiv aveda. But what about in a case of a meshiv aveda? It seems like the Gemara is acknowledging that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, there too you wouldn't need to take a shvuah. So the question goes back to Rabbi Yitzchak. How could Rabbi Yitzchak then say that you do take a shvuah? This doesn't seem to be resolved by the Gemara, unless you understand that from the Gemara's standpoint, it's altogether possible that in a situation where Rabbi Yitzchak paskins that you have to take a shvuah when you're a meshiv aveda, Rabbi Yitzchak goes so far as to say that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, even when you're meshiv aveda and you're a moida b'miktsas, you're going to have to take a shvuah because perhaps you're riddled with guilt over the fact that you have this object that you know belongs to somebody else. Although that's not the way the language of the Gemara implies, that really is the only way to understand why Rabbi Yitzchak would say you have to take a shvuah. I mean, if after all, anytime you volunteer information and there's no reason for you to be riddled with guilt because you're not facing a creditor, so then we shouldn't impose a shvuah because of tikkun ha'olam. Unless you learn that Rabbi Yitzchak feels that no, sometimes people will feel conscience riddled even when they're just retrieve someone else's lost object, and therefore they may feel that they can't lie completely and they'll only make a partial admission to the owner. And therefore Rabbi Yitzchak says even when cases of hashavas aveda, there will be times when you have to take a shvuah. But the sugya leaves off with a shtickle tzarachian on Rabbi Yitzchak. I have to admit, it's not resolved really satisfactorily, and tzarachian to really figure out how we completely put Rabbi Yitzchak to rest and make it not problematic for him. Okay, have a great day, everybody.